Well, while we're settling on today, I thought I'd let you know about some things that you probably don't know about. Sometimes when I get ready to do classes like this, I check my facts last minute just to make sure. The only problem with that, you get caught in a rabbit hole. There's a site called restorationmovement.com that I didn't even know existed. If I would have not taken a class 40 years ago in restoration history because he put all the notes for that class on there. And my notebook is now worthless. But it also has a list of graves of people who are connected to the restoration movement. I don't know about you, but I enjoy looking at cemeteries. I enjoy them more now because I'm closer to one than I used to be. But as I was looking through there is an interesting grave down at the Pioneer Cemetery by the John Neely Bryan cabin downtown that I never knew was there. I've got jury duty sometime next month or in June, and if they let me out early, I'm going to go look. But there's a grave in the Pioneer Cemetery in Dallas of Barton W. Stone, Jr., the son of Barton W. Stone, who was one of the first settlers in the city of Dallas. And that's kind of a fascinating thing. I didn't know that was true. It only took me about 2 hours to find that little fact out. So now that you know it, you don't have to do that. But we'll give you some more things, and I think we're about settled now, and so we'll get started. We're continuing our study on why we are what we are, but I want to start with a question tonight. What causes arguments? Opinions. Yeah, that's pretty good, yeah. What causes arguments? Disagreement. What do we disagree about?
Anything and everything.
Yeah, well, I'd kind of like to narrow that down a little bit, but that's what causes the disagreements?
Strong opinions.
Okay, what causes a strong opinion? I can play this game all night, but that's
Usually it's based on facts. One person knows the facts and the other one thinks they know the facts.
okay. Or both of them think they know the facts and they're both interpreting the facts,
Yes.
which tends to be a problem. The reason I bring that up is because we're caught in the middle of arguments in this series right now. As we have told you, there are 3 cornerstones to restoration. You're going to see all 3 of them tonight in some way. The first is the Bible enough? Do you have to have anything else besides it? The second is, how do you put the church together? How do you make worship happen? How do you make organization happen? How does a person become a Christian? Those things are the practical nitty-gritty things of what you've got to do. And then restoration over unity or unity over restoration. Which do you prioritize if push comes to shove? And while those things look pretty simple and pretty innocent as we unfold the lesson tonight, you're going to find out how sinister they are, because each one of them, those 3 ideas, will collide in more and more destructive ways as time passes. They've already started that, as we have mentioned. It all started, they joined the right hand of fellowship in 1830, but it wasn't within 5 to 6 years that they started trying to figure out, if we're going to cooperate, how do we do it? And it soon moved from cooperation to organization. Do you develop an organization apart from the local church that does mission work, sends out preachers, those things? And what is their role and how do we do that? A lot of confusion, a lot of complaint about that. And then last week we looked at the Civil War. The Civil War added an emotional component to that. The first was more philosophical and theological and intellectual. Now we got down to where we're calling each other names. And when that happens, it's hard to start talking again. And therein lies the difficulty of the last one that we're going to look at tonight, which is the instrument controversy. What's interesting about the instrument controversy is we think it's been here forever, but it hasn't. It will come down to a single issue. The issue is, how do you interpret the Bible? And that will become the central issue, and it still is today, by the way. What I'm going to tell you tonight is still in existence in churches in this area constantly. Same things, same arguments being used to make points. So when you come to the instrument controversy, you find out for the first 50 to 60 years, first generation, no congregation associated with the Restoration movement used an instrument in worship. Not one. There were no renegade churches. There was no progressives. There were no liberals. There were no any of the names we want to use today to describe those. They didn't exist. And they didn't exist because they all had a common idea. It was probably best voiced by Alexander Campbell. He had no fondness for instrumental music. In fact, what he said was, if you look around to the denominational world as it exists, they all used instruments. And it's out of that background he wrote this in the Millennial Harbinger. If churches had no real devotional or spirituality in them, read that as denominational churches. That's what that really means. Then instrumental music might be an essential prerequisite to devotion. But to spiritually minded Christians, it is like a cowbell in a concert. He had an interesting way of demolishing people. He didn't fight arguments, he fought people. He was an iconoclast. He took on anything that was moving that was that way. And he said this is like a cowbell in a concert if you use an instrument of music. But in 1860, it began to shift. In Midway, Kentucky, this is the building that was there originally, but they put brick on top of what was there originally in 1860. Pay attention to the fact this is 1860 with the Civil War brewing in the background. This will factor in how things work. When you're already irritated, one more irritation doesn't help. If your wife, for instance, you come in and the kids have been screaming all day long and you say, the dinner's cold. It's no longer about the dinner. That was true about this. It was no longer the same thing. So at Midway, Kentucky, they had a preacher. His name was Dr. L.L. Pinkerton. Pinkerton was the first honest-to-goodness theological liberal Churches of Christ ever had. I'll explain that term next week because it goes along with next week. But theological liberalism is different than what you and I think it is. But L.L. Pinkerton brought in a melodeon. And the reason he brought in the melodeon was the singing was bad. The way he described it was, it would scare the rats out of worship. Now, I have to tell you, in my first full-time church, one of the most interesting elders meetings I ever went to was we discussed a single topic. We were all out in the country, and so what would happen is field mice would come and get in and fall into the baptistry. So when you baptize somebody, you have to fish them out. It makes our problems look pretty small here, frankly. And so all kinds of interesting solutions. I won't go into that. But when I found this out, I thought maybe we ought to use a piano if it's going to drive the rats out of the church building. That's being facetious, obviously. Now, it's interesting because Pinkerton didn't have a big following. In fact, most of his church didn't like it. They were angry about it. In fact, he had one of the elders who had slaves. He had one of his slaves go and steal it out of the church building and take it to his barn. Well, on top of that, one of Pinkerton's supporters stole it back and put it back in the church building. Can you imagine that as a cartoon? You know, they're stealing a melodeon and moving it back and forth. And one church member said, I think I'll take an axe down there and just hack it up. And then he was stopped before it happened. But that was always a creative solution to instrumental music, by the way. It's going to happen again. But this was the first place it was ever used in the Restoration movement. And it was soundly denounced by everybody, it seemed like. We have two passages we rely on to talk about music in the church. One is Ephesians chapter 5, verse 19, and the other is Colossians chapter 3, verse 16. They're parallel passages. Paul writes to both churches in the area. It appears these letters are supposed to be passed back and forth. In Ephesians, it talks about speaking. It talks about making music in your heart and singing. Colossians, it talks about admonishing and singing with gratitude in your hearts. I want to point out one thing in these two passages. Not one place in there does it say these words, "Thou shalt not use an instrument." We wish it did. I wouldn't be happy to teach this class tonight. But it doesn't say that. And therein lies part of the problem. When you read passages that talk about worship, you don't get all the specifics you want out of those passages. Which brings up the issue of expediency. Expediency is a concept been around a long time, but it took special front and center issue in churches of Christ, especially about this issue. I remember when I was a boy, I'd hear preachers preach about this. We don't preach about it the same way anymore, but they preach about and they go into expediency. I'll never forget, I had no earthly idea when I was 8 years old what that meant. I suspect there are a lot of people in the church today who are grown-ups that don't know what that means either. And that was the problem here. Remember, it was introduced by Campbell himself when he was talking about how are we going to organize the church, not cooperate, organize for mission work. And what he said was the New Testament doesn't give details of organization. It does, but he didn't think it did it about how do churches work together as much. Therefore, he said, it's a matter of expediency. Now, he opens that door. And you open a door that's not going to close, and something's going to happen. Because here's the logical inference you can make from that. If that was true, by extension, the New Testament does not give details of worship. Therefore, it is a matter of expediency. Meaning, you can do what you need to do to make that command happen. We do have expedients, by the way. This is an expedient. The screen on Sunday morning with the words, project words, music is an expedient. What I'm doing tonight with a projector is an expedient. It helps us accomplish the goal that's stated. That's what it means. The question is, does that really help or not? The first to get on that bandwagon was in 1864. His name was A.S. Hayden, and he wrote an article in the Christian Standard that said an instrument is nothing more than an expedient to aid in singing. We can't sing very well without one, so if you add one, we can all sing better. That's the argument. Or we can't sing at all if you don't have something playing behind you to help you sing. That's really the argument. Hayden was very intent on that idea. However, in response to that, a man by the name of H.T. Anderson is having a discussion in the Christian Standard with a man named Robert Richardson, who happens to be the biographer of Alexander Campbell. And what he said was, there is no law about instrumental music. Interpretation, you don't find anything that says you can or you can't. He's right. There's nothing that says you can or you can't. And it says, therefore, there's no transgression where there's no law. If there's not a law, whatever you do is not going to be wrong because there's nothing that says you have to do it one way or the other. It's only an expedient in carrying out what we do read. In other words, it says sing, and so an instrument, if it helps us sing, is an expedient. That's his argument. Richardson, though, writes back in another article, this is how you had debates in the 1860s. You wrote articles. And everybody read them. You know, today you couldn't make much of an argument from articles because nobody'd read it. Even on the internet, there's too much to read. But he said, before there can be expediency, there must be a law. You have to have something that tells you one way or another, then you know what to do. And his point was, look at prayer. The New Testament says you need to pray, but it doesn't tell you these things. It doesn't tell you where to pray, how long to pray, what time of day to pray, those things you can decide for yourself. Those are the expediencies.
I'm still not sure about that.
I am.
I'm sorry.
I always like that. I love the story. If we were interrupted, I might as well go and finish it. There was a preacher who was preaching one time, and a phone rang, and he said, "That better be Jesus calling." So I'm not going to use that line, but I just used it. That's okay. The use of musical instruments, he said, in the church can never be a question of expediency, for the simple reason that no law is prescribing it, or, listen to the words, authorizing it. Another big word. Expediency, authorize. We've used that word for 150 years. Does it? Authorize it. And we've used it for other contexts as well. He went on to say, whatever adds or subtracts from, in any way, modifies divine ordinances, affects its character. Meaning, whatever we do will change how we think about it. Listen to that carefully. Whatever we do changes how we think about it. Now that is true. I've learned that along this way. I remember I had an elder one time who he was so against divorce. Divorce was the unpardonable sin. Anybody got a divorce, you kick him out of the church. That was his view. Right up until his son got a divorce. Now we can forgive everybody. I saw it happen in a week because your mind doesn't like to work that way. Well, Pendleton, W.K. Pendleton, who happened to be the son-in-law of Campbell, said that he enjoyed music of all kinds. And he counseled, though, that you shouldn't force it, because if he would say, I would rather never hear one again than to have them interfering with the free, full, grateful, heartfelt singing of the whole congregation. That tended to be a good argument. I don't really see anything wrong with it, but I'm not going to make it to where it's hard for people to worship if they object to it. Now, it sounds reasonable. We're going to find out it's not as reasonable as it sounds. Isaac Garrett, though, who is pushing to the left in the Christian Standard, said it's not a question of right and wrong. The sin comes, he says, when you offend your brother's scruples. See, that's the same argument that Pendleton made. It's sinful to crush the conscience of another for your selfish reasons. So the sin is there. The sin is not in the instrument, it's how it's used. And that sounds reasonable, like I said. On the other side was J.W. McGarvey. McGarvey wrote a series of articles in the Millennial Harbinger in response to Hayden, and in Lard's Quarterly, a newer journal that was running in the South. And he said, let's not let the innovations, another big word, take over. In fact, he counseled even stronger responses. Preachers should not preach for those who practice instrumental music. Christians should refuse to place membership at churches using an instrument, and withdraw from a church that begins using it. What he's saying is the way we stop this thing is we dry it up at the source, because if they can't hire a preacher and if they don't have any members and they don't have any support from other churches, they won't use it. Oh, if it was only that simple. But that's what he counseled, and this is pretty hard. This is where we got an idea that didn't come out of Scripture, it came out of McGarvey, that you can withdraw fellowship from a congregation. And McGarvey said you can do that. But the reality was that a few started using the instrument, a few congregations. But by 1870, only 50 out of 10,000 congregations were using it. A drop in the bucket. But I want you to think about something. A drop in the bucket over and over again fills the bucket. And that's what's going to happen. Because within a quarter century, it's going to be different. It will begin to have effects on churches all over the brotherhood. For instance, let's start with Isaac Errett and his little statement about the sin comes when you offend your brother's scruples. That looks like that would be the bank for the river. That would be the controlling problem. Unless you don't care about the scruples of others. And that's what began to happen. They began to use the term called freedom. Adrian College existed at Thorpe Springs, Texas, which is just the building on the bottom right is still there. It's about 7 miles north of Granbury. This is the only remains of Adrian College. Adrian College was established by a man named Joseph Addison. And it became a liberal arts college. He taught women and men, which was unusual. One of the things they did at Adrian was every year in the spring they'd have a revival for the students. They had never used an instrument in Sunday morning worship or any time the community was invited. But they did have an organ for music lessons. The music lessons were taught by a woman named Bertha. That becomes an important detail. But the students prevailed upon the sons, Addison and Randolph, hence the name of Adrian College. Joseph named it after his two sons. That they should be allowed to use an instrument of worship in the revival. And to keep the young folks happy, that's the way we'd say it today, Addison and Randolph agreed. On the night the revival began, Joseph, the old man, hobbled to the front with his cane, fumbled in his pocket and took out a piece of paper and handed it to his son Addison. Addison took the paper, unfolded it, and read it, went over to Randolph. It was basically a request by the members of the congregation not to use the instrument because it did offend their consciences. Addison and Randolph talked for a moment. They sympathized, but because they had already made a promise to the students, they held firm that they were going to use it. And Addison pointed his finger and said, "Play on, Miss Bertha." And she started, and with that 150 members, led by Joseph Clark, walked out of the auditorium for good. Addison and Randolph got together the next morning and said, "This is going to be bad. It's going to kill us." And they were right. Within a year, Adrian College no longer existed. They moved to Waco thinking they could make a fresh start, but their building burned down within 6 months, probably because of arson, if I had to make a guess. And out of that came two other places that we all know well. One went to Fort Worth, the instrumentals, and became Texas Christian University. The others, a few years later, founded a little place out in West Texas called the Children's Institute that would become Abilene Christian University. They would be non-instrumental. The question, did it unify anybody? No. Did it restore anything? Nope. This was the problem. We begin to see it more and more. I told you about this little church last week. This is the first church I preached at. And I told you the story about how the man who was the driving force had decided he didn't want to vote again after the Civil War. Something else happened in 1890. The church kind of rebuilt after the Civil War. It's doing pretty well. And then some of the more rich and well-connected members of the church paid to have a preacher come to town to hold a meeting. And he insisted, though, that they have an instrument at that meeting. The members prevailed on the elders not to do this, and they were sympathetic. But because of the power of the rich and well-connected members, they had to give it up. So out of that, those members walked out as well. What happened was no one could keep that building, but the rich and powerful built a better one in downtown Georgetown, just south of the square. And this one moved out to the hinterlands off of Highway 95 in Georgetown. This is what would play out over thousands of churches of Christ over the next 100 years. That those who poured their lifeblood and their money and their time building the church on the basis of restoration of New Testament principles would find themselves devoid of everything they built and spiritual orphans. That was the problem. The effect was saying to those who oppose the instrument, go away. We don't want you. And that was a potent message, and they got it. They got it. And if you wanted to stay, you had to use the instrument, but if you didn't want to use the instrument, you had to go. It's a simple problem. Remember I said a change of practice demands a change of doctrine. You cannot hold a different idea in your mind than you practice. It just doesn't happen. You will change either your practices or you will change how you think about those practices and find some justification in Scripture to make it happen. If you don't believe this happens, there is a church in San Francisco, and this is from the 1970s, by the way, that wasn't Churches of Christ, but it was called the Community Fellowship Church, and it was the first openly gay church in the country. And the way they justified homosexuality was they said we had to reinterpret Scripture to find out what Paul really said. The term reinterpret becomes important. Here's the problem. When you start to reinterpret on the basis of what you've done already, you're not thinking clearly. After all, the text was supposed to have informed your practice, but many times what would happen, the practice would then begin to inform the text. This is what we're doing. Let's find a good reason why we can. Now, we do that a lot. Let's find a good reason why we can. I had an elder once who smoked like a chimney. And I was young and stupid. So I asked him a question. Why don't you quit smoking? And he said, the doctor told me I would die if I quit smoking. Because I am so addicted, it would kill me if I quit smoking. Now, about 3 years later, they found a tumor in his lung. The amazing thing was he quit smoking. And he died about 2 years later after that, but he died not from quitting smoking, but because the tumor was there before he quit. He found a reason to do what he was doing. That's what we tend to do. And so the controversy of the instrument exposed some of the challenges of the restoration that we didn't think were there. You remember when you get started, everybody's on board. This is going to be the greatest thing. We're going to restore the New Testament church in its purity, in its simplicity, in its basic form, and we're going to know what to do, and we're going to be unified because we do that. The only problem is that all of these controversies begin to expose what the difficulties were. There comes a point where you say, is the Bible enough? But the question then becomes, well, what's in the pattern? What's in the Bible? What does the Bible say? Does the Bible allow this or not? And what came to be in the instrument issue was, is silence permissive or prohibitive? If it doesn't say you can't, does that give you authorization to say you can? Or if it says if it doesn't say you can't, does that say you can't do anything but what's written there? Now that sounds kind of strange the way I put it, but let me put it this way. Back in the early 70s, the state of Texas did not have a law that says you can stop and make a right turn on a red light. We do that all the time now. California had that law. Texas didn't have that law. My grandfather lived in Escondido, California. He'd come to see us. He'd get in the car, my dad would be in the front seat, and he'd start driving. He'd pull up to a red light, look around, nobody's coming. He makes a turn. My dad says, "You can't do that." He said, "Why not? Doesn't say you can't." We were asking that question. It doesn't say you can't. Well, what does it mean when there's nothing there to tell you what to do? Do you stay with what's there, or do you say it can do almost anything? I'd like to point out how slippery this is. Remember, this is an expediency. Nothing in the Old New Testament tells you about songbooks, does it? It doesn't say thou shalt or thou shalt not. It says to sing. Tonight we have sung with songbooks in the devotional, but we also sang without songbooks. Which is scriptural? You.
I think, I can't answer that question, but I can direct you back to the passage where you said hymns and songs.
Mm-hmm.
There's a difference between a hymn and there's a difference between a song. But if you look at, that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to look at
What that was, yeah.
Okay. One is a song written to music.
Okay.
It doesn't necessarily mean it's sung to music.
Okay.
It's there for the melody.
Okay.
The other one is more like a rhyme.
Mm-hmm. Okay. It's more like a chant in a sense. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think using that scripture, a lot of people say, well, right there.
Yeah.
Hymns and songs.
Okay. Yeah.
And they think that justifies it. But if you looked at the definition of the two,
Mm-hmm.
they're basically both done
Okay.
without instruments.
Okay.
One is, it's a melody
Mm-hmm.
that's harmonized,
Mm-hmm.
and the other one is rhythmic.
Okay. Let me ask you this question. Can you sing without words or music?
You can argue. Well, I mean,
In your heart?
In your heart? How are you going to know what it is? How are you going to speak then? Okay. See, if it says speak and admonish, there's an oral quality to that, isn't there? And I really don't have a long time to do this, but we're going to do it anyway. Yeah.
Does this get into a necessary reference?
Uh-huh. Eventually it does.
That it mentions only sing and make melody in your heart.
Uh-huh.
That eliminates an instrument.
That's been the argument churches of Christ have used, that the instrument is specified because the instrument is the heart. But here's the other side of that issue. Oh, go ahead, Sheila.
The other thing is we cannot admonish or teach one another if we're not.
With an instrument. That's right. Here's what the other side will say. And that will say is, but you can still sing with an instrument.
Yeah.
Now, I will counter that. I told my class on Sunday morning, I have a good friend in Galveston County who is the preacher of the Christian church. Great guy. We hung around together. We go to lunch together, do all kinds of stuff. What was basically different between the Christian church, conservative Christian church, and Churches of Christ was this, the instrument. And one day I sent my kids to VBS, his church, because they had all these friends that went to the Christian church. And they had this program the last night. Well, they had the kids sing these songs they learned in Bible classes that week, and they had a piano. I didn't sing, but it was a great experiment because I got a chance to see if they did. Remember, you can still sing if you have an instrument. Nobody was singing. So I told Fred, we had lunch, I said, Fred, I got a question. Anybody in your church sing? So we sing all the time. I said, when? Now, he didn't like me much right then. He didn't feel comfortable with what I was saying. He said, we sing with, I said, with that instrument, with that piano? He said, yeah, we sing with it. I said, Fred, I've been to your church. I didn't see anybody singing. And he said, well, yeah, I guess you're right. Joe?
Quick.
Sure.
Aren't we to follow the pattern of the first century church?
Yeah,
Did they have these?
if they, see the instrument there, they'll also go, we don't read an instrument one way or another.
They didn't have
Yeah.
instruments for
Yeah.
years.
Yeah. This whole class could go for 3 hours. Anybody want to stay? Don't have any takers, but that's okay. We're not going to let it go 3 hours. I've got someplace else I got to go. But this is the problem. Is the silence permissive or prohibitive? Now, we haven't figured that one out yet because it changes with the context of Scripture. For instance, it says that the church met in upper rooms in the book of Acts. Every time you have, they met in an upper room. Does that mean the silence about sitting on the first floor means you can't do that? Should we have built this church building on stilts? I do know some churches that did that. Because they said that's the pattern.
But Paul worshiped on the riverbank.
Yeah, I can tell you then. They said, so should we all be down on the riverbank? Okay. Let's try that in July and see how many people like it. We got a creek back here. We'll just dismiss and go down there.
Did not Jesus with his disciples, when they were in the upper room, sing songs?
They sang a hymn.
Okay. Did they have an instrumental music?
We don't know.
I can't imagine them.
But see, you can now imagine them, but we don't know. There's our. I'm not trying to argue. I'm trying to tell you why this is an issue.
It says where 2 or 3 are together. I'm in the midst, so
Where 2 or 3 are together, you'll have an argument. No, that's facetious. I'm not trying to dismiss that, but that's the best we can tell. That's right. From a historical point of view, that we cannot find it until what, 650? I think it's the first time.
But that's why they call it a cappella.
Why, after the manner of the church. That's right. That's right. So this is one of those issues, and I didn't mean for this to be the doctrinal discussion. Like I said, that's about 2 hours. But the big question is, how do you put, here's the second issue that we look at, big cornerstone. How do you put the church together? Then the question is, what did the New Testament church do? See, the problem is, the first one says what's in the pattern. The second one says, well, then when you read it, what did they really do? This calls you to dig in some more. But the tension is here. What did they do in the New Testament? And what do I want to do today? Compounding that is the crush of culture in which we witness churches across town that are bigger, draw more young people than we do, blah, blah, blah. And they have a band out front. And so we say, do we want to follow the New Testament pattern of the New Testament church and stay the way we are, or do we want to go and be like them? That's one of the big flowing parts right now. The big reason in the 21st century churches of Christ, some have gone to using an instrument, is for this simple reason. It will bring people in. It's evangelistic. Now, my question would be, do we really need that kind of evangelism? But that's me being cantankerous, I suppose.
Robert, they didn't have church buildings, did they?
Probably not. They met in homes.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of things. The New Testament doesn't tell us a whole lot, to tell you the
So
truth.
set up a room in a church.
Well, it could, no, but it's, the biggest problem is we don't know a lot about what the New Testament church looked like. There's not a lot of detail that tell us in great broad strokes. Now, for instance, it doesn't say on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock they gathered together in a central location where there are 4 walls and padded pews, and they sang with songbooks without an instrument. That's the passage we want to find. That's the Dead Sea Scrolls we want to find, I guarantee you. We're not going to find it, but that's it. But all of this forced a choice. Do you restore at the cost of unity, or do you unify at the cost of restoration? And we have gone two different ways. There are some in the restoration movement who've said unity above all things. Those who say Bible above all things. All of the same root, different viewpoint. Yes?
When the children of Israel, and actually mankind from the very beginning, actually, when they were fascinated by doing what somebody else was doing, they went wrong
That's-
every time.
There's always that movement in the wrong direction when you want to be like everybody else.
Exactly.
Yeah,
We want a king.
yeah.
We want a king.
It's the same thing we use with our kids that say, if everybody wants to jump off a cliff, are you going to do it too? The answer is no, but we all jump off of cliffs a lot, what it comes out to. The one thing about the instrument I'll leave you with tonight, it was never unifying, it was always divisive, always. That was true in denominational churches. That's true in the Baptist churches. That was true in Presbyterian churches. Almost all of them started without an instrument and went to one. They didn't start with one and then quit doing it. It was always divisive, never unifying. Which means, as the clock strikes 8, we're going to talk about the Humpty Dumpty movement next week. Remember the Humpty Dumpty song? Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, and all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. That's the story of the church. And we're going to look at that next week. So thank you very much. I know I thoroughly confused you. That's okay. You can scratch your brain tonight.